Good morning, everybody. My name is Trevor Phillips. I am chairing this session. I have a distinguished panel with me, Karen Blackett, the country manager for the UK of WPP, Mark McLane, who's the global head of diversity and inclusion at Barclays, and Nguyen, who's principal at Boston Consulting Group. I'm going to say a little bit more about them in a second. I am, amongst other things, now former president of the John Lewis Partnership and chair of the executive headhunter Green Park. I also do spend about a third of my time in the United States, and probably the main reason I'm here is I'm a former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. We have this distinguished panel to help us understand how people who are not in our business, in the television business, or business I used to be in, cope with the challenges of diversity and inclusion. I just want to say very briefly, reasons to pay attention. It's very interesting. I'm now clocking, by the way, who has stayed in the room for this session and who has left. I've got a list of names already. Broadcast, we're ready. Yesterday I went to a session held by the Financial Reporting Council, which many of you will not have heard, on diversity reporting. How dull could that possibly be? Accountants talking about annual reporting. Well, actually, the FRC had to change its venue twice because of the demand for places. And in the end, 350 people squeezed into the TUC's Congress Hall. Why? Well, I think there are two reasons. One, risk. And I only need to say the words Uber, Weinstein, and now CBS to give you some indication of where we are. I've personally seen succession plans, expensive succession plans, destroyed at two global firms whose products you will all have used in the last week or so. And I know about them because we were called in on a rescue mission because nobody quite knew what to do. So there's big risk and big money involved here. And secondly, here in Britain, particularly I think for the TV industry, there's an issue which perhaps we haven't caught yet, which is the cost of talent. When I started in television, I came to television, I was a chemist, I came to television because it paid twice what I could earn elsewhere. Now, starting lawyers in their early 20s city will earn over 100,000 to begin at an American firm. It is possible that in time, only people whose parents were in the television business and are called Dimbleby will want to join, and even fewer will get in. We are potentially no longer competitive for talent, and television could become a bit like the English aristocracy, reduced to a dwindling pool of rather inbred talent. So, these things are important. Now, how are we going to handle this session? First of all, I'll say a few words about things that I think we agree about, so we don't need to talk about them too much. I'm going to then turn to Deborah Williams, who is Chief Executive of the Creative Diversity Network, to talk to us about where we are now, and then I'm going to come to our panel to hear from them, and then I'm going to put out some challenges to you lot. So let's start with where we might all agree. Whether we follow through is another question, but this morning, let's just establish some orthodoxies which we don't need to argue about. I think it's widely accepted that diversity and inclusion is good for business as well as good for the soul. No arguments about that. There's a relationship between what goes on behind the screen, who is on it, and who sits on the other side of it. There is an orthodoxy that diversity will improve performance. And I think most people are now coming to the conclusion that what matters most is not the categories, man, woman, black, white, etc., but the variety of outlook, experience, and perspective. And the first set of categories are an indication for the second. And lastly, in context of today's discussion, probably that diversity could be a source of differentiation. We all agree that we need data, and I just want to give one quick example from the work that my data analytics company, Weber Phillips, does. We can tell you, if you want to sell a car to a woman or to a South Asian person, what colour to paint it, but I'm not going to tell you because that's going to cost you. But some work that we've done for arts companies will tell us that we ran 500,000 transactions for a particular art centre, which shows that some ethnic groups prefer to attend alone because what they're really interested in is what's going on the stage, whereas other groups tend to want to book as a family because what they're really interested in is a family evening out. We were also able to show that while there can be a relationship between performers and the audience by gender and race, it isn't always the case. It's kind of obvious why Japanese bookers for events might want to come to a Shakespeare performance which is in Japanese. It is not so obvious why Sikh and Hindu bookers significantly over-index for Italian minimalist music, as they do, or why Muslims over-index for an exhibition of non-Muslim abstract art. There is an explanation, but I haven't got time to give it to you here. So data isn't just interesting, it can help us understand both what to do and who to hire. And that is why so many of you have invested in the project Diamond, which I'm going to ask Deborah to come and talk to us about right now. Deborah Williams.
Whoever started the clapping first, thank you. I'm not intimidated. I'm not nervous. No, I'm fine. So, I have a lovely speech that I learned over the weekend, and then there were a few changes thrown at me yesterday. So, by an individual, he knows who he is. And so I've got the speech in front of me, so forgive me for using it as a bit of a crib sheet. But there are certain things that I have to let you know about. So, first of all, I'm an artist. I'm a theatre maker, a writer, and as a rule I write monologues. They're very witty, they're very sarcastic, and people laugh at them and clap. Hint. Today I've got just 6 minutes to do a sort of state of the nation where we are sort of across across the UK broadcasting industry. So, first of all, the conference theme consolidation is really quite key to CDN. For 14 years, UK broadcasters, between themselves, did a lot of work around diversity, and they would pass it on every 2 years, and it would sort of be consistent and ad hoc. 2014, after much external shoving and pressure and pushing, they came together to consolidate, see what I did there, for the greater good. And that greater good was Diamond. For those of you that don't know what it is, in its simplest sense, it's the world's first and only online data collection and monitoring system for diversity. There you go, so yeah, I'm reading. It continuously gathers data on people across the entire supply chain, UK broadcasting, on-screen and off-screen, and who have been commissioned by one of the Diamond broadcasters, so Channel 5, Viacom, Channel 4, ITV, BBC or Sky, for programmes that are first transmitted in the UK. So it was switched on the 16th of August 2016, and it is collecting data all the time. I'm not going to tell the whole story because, well, I haven't got any time, and it's very boring and very sad. But essentially, the build it and they will come idea is what kept us going for the first 2 years of the system, to try and build it and get it working properly and get people engaged with it. A side effect of that, of course, was that other people started to pay attention. So regulators, global competitors, national industries. My personal favourite was the first class travel to Australia at someone else's expense to do strategic breakfasts and talks and be incredibly charming on panels. Which led to Australia now building its very own, Australia's screen industry is now building its very own version of Diamond. So that's the sort of first bit, our competitors, our peers, and who we are. So what are the actual people, the nice folk that work in telly? Well, there's a bit of a fault line there, if we're honest. On one side, you sort of had CDN and its members and its membership thinking about large-scale transformative change and things that will change systems for the future. And on the other, you have individuals who are seeking support for themselves and work for themselves. And there's sort of a bit of a to and fro. And as you know, with media, the negative story leads. So we haven't had as much time as we would like to really think about and talk about the magnitude of what has actually been done. So that's one of the quests for the next few months, is to figure out how to bring those two sides together and make sure we're working together better. Because we want to be the global leader in this area, just like our members are in everything else that they do and deliver. I'm going to show you some slides now, sorry. So I'm going to get a bit PowerPointy, but anything could happen. So that's the first slide, and on there you've got, basically you've got the volume of what's in Diamond at the moment. So the first two are what was the first cut, which was the first report we published in August last year. The second two columns are the update, which was published in May this year, and then the last two columns are where we are now. So we've sort of got just under 800, just over 750,000 contributions inside the system over just under 2 years, which is not too bad, I guess. Oh, am I right? Yeah, so this is how the original breakdown was. The first column is what is sort of under the Equality Act in terms of protected characteristics. The second column is our version of that, and then the third are the percentages. So now the national averages, I'm trying to remember what these are, the comparators. It's 50-50 for gender, I think. Gender identity, transgender, there isn't actually a percentage, but the perceived wisdom is 1%. Age 50 plus is 32% in terms of population. BAME and ethnic origin is 14%. LGB is 13%, and there are sort of two different metrics for that, but essentially we work with 13%. And disabled people and disability is 18%. So as you can see, that's quite interesting in terms of on-screen representation. We then have off-screen representation, which the same percentages apply, but as you can see, we're not doing quite as well off-screen as we are on-screen as a UK industry. And then just as a little comparator are the perceived data. So what people think they see on television, these are the stats for that. So as you can see, disability and LGB are very low compared to on and off screen. And actually, even gender is, which I'm quite intrigued by. How can you not tell a woman from a man on television by looking at them? I don't know. This is the Ofcom data, which covers 6 protected characteristic groups from the first report from last year, which, again, is pretty similar to ours. They collect religion, which we don't, and their age is based on the ONS figures for age, not sort of a 50-plus figure. But essentially, we're looking at approximately, similar data sets for both. And I think, finally, my final slide is this. So this is where we are. So the last column is the most interesting one because that's new data. So in terms of where we started with 6,000 individuals giving us data as of August between 2016 and 17. We then updated it to just over 7,000. We are now, as we hurtle toward publishing our second report, at 18,000. So across the system, we have 30,000 people altogether. But within the system for the last year, we've doubled the figure of individuals that contribute to, that are giving us data, diversity data, and sitting inside of Diamond. So we're not doing that bad. I think in terms of the data sets, the Ofcom data and our data, the similarities are there for themselves. There's considerable underrepresentation of disabled people. There is underrepresentation of minority and ethnic groups and people over 50, in particular in senior roles and off-screen. But it's not all bad news. As you see, the progress is quite considerable. I did try and get a sneak at the Ofcom data, but they wouldn't let me see it. But apparently they are publishing shortly, so we can have a bit of a chat about that later in the day, so to speak. But I have to say, the data was like milkshake. It brought all the boys to the yard. They came screaming, and so we now have data specialists wanting to work with us, open data aficionados, global data and diversity experts. CDN now has an academic partner. They're going to keep us honest and on our toes. And as we hurtle towards second cut, I'm confident we're going to be able to look at better insights, more data sets, more contributions, more contributors, and really offer to have a more considerable conversation about those nice folk that work in telly. We've got some build confidence and some academic credibility. What next for us in terms of CDN? As you saw with the data set, the first big issue is around disabled people. So I'm pleased to say that our first big project as a result of looking at Diamond data will be called Doubling Disability, which is all the Diamond broadcasters are committing to work with us over the next 2 years to double the percentage of disabled people working in broadcasting off-screen. That's not a challenge at all. I think that's really simple and absolutely doable, but I would say that. We're rolling out a selection of events. RTS are partnering with us on some of them, which is quite nice. Diamond's changed the conversation, I think, fundamentally, and having a good set of consistent data gathering has changed the conversation. So as you all approach your chase of the fangs and the regional nations and regions devolution and acquisitions and mergers, I'm going to be like a sheepdog, sort of making sure, hurling you all in the right direction to make sure that ED&I stays at the heart of what's going on in the heart of the conversation. We're doing okay, in my opinion. You know, diversity is written into our sector deal. The government think of us as an exemplar. Behind closed doors, we're leading the thinking, but we've got so much more work to do to become the thought leaders. I'm going to shut up now, which is a rare thing. I'm going to hand back to Trevor, hand back to the panel for 2 reasons. 3 reasons. 1, I'm supposed to. 2, I need to pick up some things and steal from them. They're good ideas. And then I need to learn what we're not doing well enough. But anyway, hopefully, that gives you a vague idea of where we are in the industry and what's going on. Trevor.
Thank you, Deborah. Now, as an initial skeptic, I'm delighted to see that Diamond is making progress. Okay, now on the platform with me, Karen Blackett, chairwoman of MediaCom. It says here the largest media agency in the UK. She was the first businesswoman to be named Britain's most influential black person in the Power List. She advises the Civil Service and Department of Trade, International Trade. Mark McLane, as I said, is the head of Global Diversity and Inclusion for Barclays. He's recently been appointed a commissioner at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and he's figured on The Guardian's global LGBT power list, as well as being on the FTSE 100 LGBT business leaders. And Nguyen is a partner and managing director at Boston Consulting Group. She is the global co-lead of the digital advertising team in media, and she leads BCG's Women at BCG's network. And she's going to publish a study on diversity in the UK workplace, so she actually knows stuff. Now, I know, unusual for something like this, but I think it'll reveal itself as we go along. Now, we know that the graph for senior women in senior positions in UK companies is flattening, and the numbers for some minorities are declining. We don't know as much as we like about disability, but this is something that people have studied pretty carefully. We also know that success is pretty narrowly defined. Tech, women and minorities are there, but they're not in the engineering division. So there are challenges. What I really want to start with is, what do we think can we do to deal with those trends? What works? Mark?
So that's a big question, right? Because that's a societal question. And I think as an organization, you have to be able to answer that question internally and externally at the same time. I think within your industry, you have a great opportunity to show role models where role models don't exist today, right? I hear this all the time at Barclays. I don't see role models that look like me, right? So part of my work is to make certain people do see role models. There might not be as many out gay men at Barclays, but when asked who's the most senior out gay man from a reporting structure, it's me. And I feel like I have a responsibility to be that role model. I think within your industry, right, growing up, not seeing gay men on TV had an impact. Meant you weren't welcome, right? So we either continue to mirror the societal barriers that push people away, right? Or we start to break those down and invite people in. That's the inclusion component of the diversity and inclusion equation. Today you looked at your data. It's great that you have data, and you have to be data-driven, but you also have to stop gazing at the data and figure out what it means and do something with it. Okay, so if we know that there are fewer women and minorities in STEM careers, what are we doing to invite them in, right? We're also, as we recruit into our organizations, do you really understand what talent you're looking for? What's the criteria for a role? Not what's the perceived degree that you need, right? So we'll take financial services as an example. Do you really need an economics background to be a banker? No, you need to be numerate. Can you come out of the arts and do that? Absolutely, positively. Will we get people from the arts? Not if we don't go on campus and recruit from them, right, from that discipline. Not if we don't open the door and invite people in. When you invite them in, they also have to feel welcome. So you can improve your diversity stats in each of the categories we talked about, right? You can do a great marketing campaign to get people to come and work for you, and just figure out what your appetite for attrition is. Because if your brand value isn't what I receive when I arrive, that drives attrition. It's your numbers. Why do people stop watching your shows? Right? Internalize some of this business practice from a colleague standpoint, right? You're building brand equity, or you're not.
Have you changed anything at Barclays to reflect that proposition?
That's an entire other panel discussion for an hour. Where to begin, right? So as Barclays is never in the news, I'm sure none of you are aware of some of the changes that have occurred in the last 7 years of my career there, right? Look, it was about recognizing exactly that. An industry where people did not feel welcome, right? Well, you've got to shift your brand. You've got to start to look at, do you have the right product to attract someone like me? Do I feel welcome, right? Will my partner be treated as have spousal equivalency? This was pre-marriage equality, right? Well, I had to ask the questions. Right? From an organizational standpoint, to give you an example, what's a huge change, right? Because everybody's looking, especially senior management, right? We're all looking for the silver bullet. What's the diversity inclusion silver bullet? Here's the secret, there isn't one. There's not one thing that's going to change. It's a scattergram approach. You've got to understand your audience, and you've got to deliver product to each of those targets. One of those is dynamic working at Barclays. This has been a sea change for us. There's a white paper on our website if anybody's really interested in the data, right? But it was recognizing that our colleagues don't even know the assets that are available to them. And the pressure of thinking some assets are only available if I hit a certain level, if I work for a certain team, if I'm a certain person, right? Can I utilize those assets? So we asked the question, how do you work your life? Not, how do you think HR is doing? What do you think about your line manager? How do you work your life? And it's all colleague driven. And it's colleagues talking about things like shared parental leave. And it's men talking about shared parental leave, because that's the barrier, right? So I architect the conversation to our own good practice to start to break down some of those barriers. And what have we seen? Right? 57% of my colleagues at Barclays, as of the end of last year, now it's 62%, identify as working dynamically. The beauty of that is it's not defined. They've defined it.
Okay. Karen, reading the business pages, you'd think there's only one person who's ever worked at WPP, but I know there's lots of other stuff goes on at WPP.
I don't know what you're talking about, Trevor.
Other than the big change, how do you think, from your experience, your company's dealt with this challenge of keeping progress going?
Look, I think, much like the television industry, we have a huge responsibility in advertising because we create cultural norms. The content that we create is essentially what people see, and that gives a measure of how we are as a society. So you want to ensure that all the businesses that you're representing, you grow those businesses, and by growing those businesses, it means that you have to ensure that your story that you tell reflects a consumer story. And I've talked a lot about the intersection of different diverse groups, because I see a number of companies that I work with focus on one particular group. And it's like, this year we're doing gender, this year we're doing disability, next year we're doing disability, and doing it one at a time. And resources are tight, which is why they're focusing on one at a time, but it's the intersection of all of it. So I talk a lot about cultural inclusion, and the analogy that I always give, I've got an 8-year-old boy who's obsessed with Marvel, so I talk a lot about the Avengers Assemble, and essentially a fantastic company is the equivalent of an Avengers Assemble. It is everybody with a superhero power. That superhero power is different, but you work together as a team. You don't always have to get on. Iron Man and Thor don't always like each other, but they work together as a team, and that's what I'm trying to promote at WPP. That's what I did at MediaCom, and that's what I'm looking at WPP. So creating an inclusion board is the first thing that you do. So rather than looking at one specific diverse group, trying to look at the intersection. You know, black women are invisible in plain sight, is the famous quote, because we're just not seen. Even though there's talent there, there's opportunity there, we're just not seen because there is a specific focus. So I think that looking at things from a cultural inclusion perspective is really important. I think absolutely what Mark was saying about role modelling is so important, which is why I do so many panels and so many events and so many talks. And I think they gave me an OBE to shut me up, to be perfectly honest.
Didn't work, did it?
No, it just gave me a microphone. But I think it's really, really important that you do have visible role models. And for me, personally, in my career, what was really important was sponsorship as well, because there were networks that I was not part of, that I couldn't penetrate, where conversations were happening about the future, about future roles, about promotions, that I was not able to access. What I needed was somebody who knew about my talent, who recognised my talent, who could talk on my behalf in those networks I wasn't part of as yet. So again, that is something that I'm looking at doing at WPP, a reverse sponsorship programme, because we have managers that need to know what it's like to be in a diverse group that they are not part of, and to make sure that they recognise talent.
Okay. And from the work that you've been doing, what makes a difference? Or what is making a difference, I should say?
Oh, I think it echoes some of the things that Karen and Mark say. There are no set criteria. I think, you know, we've been looking at this topic for quite some time, and I think some of the more interesting things that we've found and we've implemented with some of our clients is really trying to figure out what particularly works well for their organization. We did this study last year. I think it had covered 20,000 employees globally. And the great news from it was, yes, employees were feeling as if companies were making the investments. The leadership was starting to become much more vocal. And you can see it in the numbers that actually a majority of the companies were spending gobsmacking amounts of money on diversity. Very quickly, though, you realize actually where they were putting their quote-unquote diversity dollars, as we could call it, is in the wrong place. So a lot of investment was being spent in recruitment as a starting point. And sure enough, you realize very quickly getting a lot of different people from different backgrounds into the organization is great, but unless you have the infrastructure, the programs, the sponsorship programs, the mechanisms, the structure to actually retain, develop, and advance people in the organization, you end up with that leadership issue that you mentioned earlier, Trevor, where you look at the organization 5 years hence, and nothing seems to have really changed. And for me, this is one of the most important lessons I talk to our clients who've been talking to us about cultural diversity strategies, is you really need to figure out what works for you as an organization, where your organization is on their journey, and where you actually should be investing. And yes, trying to retain employees is much harder than trying to bring in people in the front door, by far and away. But there have been things that we have learned that actually do work, and not surprisingly, the things that employees value aren't necessarily the same thing that their bosses sometimes think is the most valuable, right? So you've got and our recent research, which we're going to publish in a couple of months, has found that in the UK in particular, universally employees value clear anti-discrimination policies and processes, and that I particularly emphasize that processes element of it. They value blind screening in recruitment and in promotion. And I think one of the more interesting things I found is in the UK, employees are really shouting for their voice to be heard. So what we found is employees will particularly value employee surveys, which, being a consultant, I love data, and I'm sure Deborah loves data. I think I took that for granted, and it was a norm, but it came up pretty stark, and our interpretation about that is really, it's one of the few mechanisms that employees can have to actually speak directly to their bosses. So there are a number of things that I think become standards to help organizations improve their diversity climates. But equally, there are specific things that we have found that are particularly valuable. So sponsorship, and I'm very pleased to hear Karen talking about sponsorship, I think is one of the most clear examples. Dynamic working, flexible working, by far and away one of the most, I think, structural developments within the workforce that has really moved employment sentiments. Equally, I think in the UK, and I think this is slightly different in the UK than we've seen globally, is the kind of employee need for public commitments. So leadership's not just internal commitment, but external commitment as well. And that's what we're seeing.
Okay, so we've got a kind of menu there.
Could I just add one thing to what Anne was saying, and that is getting the voice of your colleague, right? I agree with employee opinion surveys to a point, but I think there's too many organizations that are worried about how many people have filled it out versus the quality of that, exactly. Right? Yep. So first of all, if people aren't filling out your survey, listen to that. They don't want to. They don't believe you. You've lost trust. The second that I have found is again back to a business practice. I hold what are called listening groups globally by each constituency on a regular basis. They're focus groups. I ask our colleagues what we're doing well. I ask our colleagues what we need to get after. I ask our colleagues what's on the horizon. What don't I even know from a disability standpoint? What technology is out there? And then you have to act on that work. So it's not just enough to have the data, but if you're going to ask your colleagues, just because you don't agree with it doesn't mean you shouldn't get after the work. And I think that's the first barrier as leaders, because we don't see the barrier doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Get on with it.
Okay, so we've got get a plan, and we've got some elements in the plan: role models, agility, sponsorship. And by the way, sponsorship is not the same thing as mentoring.
Right.
Put crudely, mentoring is what happens when you're in the room. Sponsorship is what happens when you're not in the room. It's somebody who speaks up for you. Be comprehensive, get the process right. Money matters, and Anne's point is right. I think Intel have committed, $300 million over the next 4 year, or the current 4 year period. We worked with a bank which started to spend £1 million a year on a specific program, particularly aimed at gender recruitment. And they did an unusual thing 2.5 years in, which is they evaluated it. And what they discovered was that their £1 million a year had made precisely zero difference, except that there were slightly fewer women in leadership. So I'm going to give you the £1 million that I've got in the bank. I've just decided to make it available to each of you. What would you, 30 seconds, what would you spend it on? What would be the investment that you'd make, Anne?
So assuming the data already exists, right?
Yep.
So I would put, going back to the things that I said initially, I would make sure that the level of leadership commitment is incredibly central to this policy. And by this, let me be precise. I think Unilever is a great example. What their CEO does is, the CEO is the chair of their board on diversity, point one. Secondly, they do this great thing where they track all of their KPIs and they look at it on a monthly basis, the rest of their operational metrics. It is basically BAU for them. And so that's what I mean when I talk about leadership commitment. It has to be front and center with the rest of the business. And I would spend as much of that resource as I could to make that happen. The second thing I would do is I would go through my organization and find out actually of the various interventions that we've been talking about, what do I think would really move the needle? I think companies, I would hope that many companies have gone past the age of needing to describe their anti-discrimination policies and processes, but I get disappointed here and there. So I think making sure that those almost hygiene levels of activities are there and they're implemented well. What I've seen work not so well is let's call it town hall conversation once a year. No reinforcement, no regular conversation. Your £1 million disappears.
Okay.
So that's where I would spend it first.
Okay, Mark, £1,000,000?
Yep, £1 million would.
Yeah,
I'm going to hold them to this. At least 500K after this, right? Would be all about inclusion, right? I'd move completely away from the infrastructure because it's there at Barclays. It would be about scale around the work we're doing on the colleague campaigns and driving inclusion. And part of it would be driving greater insight into the data, so moving into analytics. Right, and this is some of the work that I'm commissioning today, but I do it at a much larger scale, is understanding where is the intersection of the work we're doing, right? The recruitment component, dynamic working, our male allies as it relates to gender, and start to invest in, can you start to draw some intersection in, if you show up as a male ally very publicly, what's your retention rate look like? What does your promotion rate look like? How do the individuals on your teams feel, right? So taking the data, the pure diversity data, the engagement data that we have today through the employee opinion surveys, but then the analytical component, the output of inclusion, and really building an inclusion indice that says, if you do more of this, right, internally, and shift your culture in this way, this is the positive impact it has on the individuals, which drives greater retention levels. We see that today. That's where I would invest in.
Okay, Karen.
Part of it would be about a cultural inclusion program for existing leaders. So I think Mark sort of said it earlier on that there's no point bringing loads of people in if once you arrive, the culture isn't right. So ensuring that existing leaders really understand what it takes to build an inclusive culture. So an inclusive culture program for our existing leaders. I would also look at implementing a tenure in role as well, because I think sometimes when you don't get talent rising to the top, it's because there is something holding them down, and you need to have movement in any organisation to allow creativity and allow talent to rise. So part of what I'd use the money for is a tenure in role programme. I believe in muscle memory in a business, but I also believe in movement in a business to allow new thinking. And I would also look at how, part of it is about data and research and making sure that there is a constant dipstick in terms of making sure you're understanding what is happening and what you need to do and which barriers or obstacles there are. And you reward the behaviour you want to see. So I'd use part of that money to reward behaviour change.
Okay, some real ideas there. Now, we've got 5 minutes. Let's see what we have from our audience. Who would like to ask a question? I emphasise the word ask a question to our panel.
Not the most diverse audience.
If there is nobody, I've got lots of
diverse
hands.
audience.
I can't see any hands.
Stunned.
There's one over there at the back.
Hello. I would like to know to what extent the panel believe that the government are actually restricting their own pledge to get more wheelchair users, as you can see on the screen, into this space by not providing such means for people like Eddie sitting next to me to come along to work with me.
More opportunities for wheelchair users and the extent the government's responsibility, you're asking specifically about that. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'll just take one more if there's another one. Who'd like to respond to that? Mark, is it a territory that you guys have been interested in?
I think I find it difficult to answer on behalf of the government, but I think if I look at the government as a business, right, I think the government has as much responsibility as any of our businesses to be more inclusive. And I can only speak for Barclays on this. I know the one thing that really moved us from a disability and accessibility standpoint was having one of our CEOs lead on disability globally, and for him to make the personal commitment that he wanted us to be the most accessible bank, and a year later said, that's not good enough, I want to be the most accessible FTSE 100 company. What I've seen in that is a real shift in exploring accessibility from a technology standpoint, from a facilities standpoint, and bringing it to the front end. I think the government can do more around disability confidence and helping themselves within infrastructure, but also organizations. And I think the partnership with the Department of Work and Pensions, I sit on the Disability Confident Leaders Group. I think it's there. I don't think it's where it needs to be with this gentleman's specific question, but I think the commitment is there. I think we as businesses need to push the government as much as the government is pushing us around targets.
Okay. Okay, there's another question there. I've got one which I think is particularly pertinent to our business. Since the Weinstein thing, this has been an issue for everybody in the entertainment industry. But the question I really want to ask, because of this particular audience, is this. When I was an executive in television, it was very common with a young person, particularly a woman who comes into the industry. One of the things you do is say, here's a coffee machine, there's, photocopier, there's a phone, there's your desk and all that stuff. But you would also say, by the way, everybody here is very nice, but try not to get in the lift with Pete, because he's a brilliant guy, he pays all our mortgages, but he is a bit weird. And that was our dealing with the issues of harassment. We were complicit. Now, the truth is that today we probably say we wouldn't do that, but I bet we do. How do you deal with the problem of complicity? Because that's, in a sense, the unspoken. Michaela Cole spoke about this at the Edinburgh Television Festival, about Salt on Her, and I suspect that there's much more than we think, particularly in our industry, partly because we have such high-value talent that we don't want to interfere with. What do you do about that?
Look, I think it comes from the top. Our new WPP Global CEO has talked a lot to all staff about respect and about we should be a company which is formed on respect and actually calling things out. And it's ensuring that the environment in which people can call things out is safe for them. So whether that's about a discrete hotline, whether that's about certain people that you go to, it is about ensuring that calling things out is easy to do. You don't feel as though there's going to be ramifications, and about a company knowing that this is a business which is built on respect and certain behaviours aren't allowed. And that absolutely has to come from the top.
And you have to send that message, right? Look, I'm looking out at an audience of senior leaders. Who are we waiting for to take that position, right? To speak up, to say, my own personal integrity, I won't allow this. It's not right. Whether you do that publicly, whether you do it one-on-one. We all have talent management systems in place. We're values-led organizations. Do you believe it or don't you? Because look, your silence is acceptance. So if you turn away from it, just know everybody else said, it's okay, I'm going to turn away from it. To speak up, I think this goes back to role models. Are you going to role model, right, the organization that you want to continue to build and the legacy you're going to leave? Or are you going to leave a legacy of complacency? That's you individually have to answer that question. I personally won't.
But I also think we need to be very transparent about the conversation. And I think one of the things that's happened in the last few years is it is okay to be having these conversations with whoever it is in the room. It is okay to speak about it openly. And I think the more that we encourage people to speak about it openly, the more important it becomes. And I'm reminded of one of our the clients we've worked with in another country around this, where we found that actually some of it becomes commonplace. People get accustomed to it. They think it's okay. And it's not until you actually start to have the conversations together that you realize, wait a minute, that's not okay. So, I fully agree with the leadership and calling out, but I think building that culture where you can have open conversations is really important.
Thank you. Have I got 30 seconds to come back to Deborah to see if she's... No, I haven't. I'm so sorry, but you'll find Deborah in the hall afterward. We have to call this to a halt. I'm going to say this twice. Back in the hall at 11:45. But before we leave, I'd like to thank our panel, Karen Blackett, Mark McLane, and Nguyen.